They'll tell you it's about integrity, about protecting the ballot, about keeping our elections free from fraud. They'll use words like safeguard, cleaning the rolls, restoring confidence. But behind the euphemisms lies something older, something darker, and something all too familiar. Because when you strip away the press conferences, the policy papers, the voter ID mailers with smiling stock photo patriots, what you find isn't reform. It's restriction. Not security, but strategy. A system designed, engineered, to decide who counts in America and who doesn't. It doesn't wear white hoods anymore. It doesn't require literacy tests at the courthouse. It doesn't charge a poll tax at the door. Now, it just quietly deletes your name from the voter roll, moves your polling place 10 miles away, demands a form of ID you don't have, draws lines through your district that slices your vote in half. This isn't a glitch in the matrix of democracy. It's the operating system. A feature, refined, updated, redeployed. A new face on an old game. But the rules haven't changed. Suppress the vote, shrink the electorate, silence the inconvenient, stay in power. Welcome to the new Jim Crow 2.0, where disenfranchisement doesn't shout anymore. It whispers, where the tools aren't torches but spreadsheets, zip codes, and legal loopholes, where the goal is the same as it ever was, to keep the wrong people from voting. Not everyone, just enough. Just the ones who might change the outcome. Just the ones who might change the future. After the Civil War, the 15th Amendment promised that the right to vote could not be denied on the basis of race. And for a brief, extraordinary moment during Reconstruction, that promise seemed real. Black men held office, local, state, even federal. Thousands voted, organized, built institutions, reshaped the South from the ground up. But that moment was short-lived, because power never gives up without a fight. And white supremacy didn't disappear. It reorganized. When federal troops pulled out of the South in 1877, Southern states moved quickly to dismantle black political power. They didn't say no blacks allowed. They said, you need to pay a poll tax. You need to pass a literacy test. You need to explain this passage from the Constitution to our satisfaction. And somehow, mysteriously, white voters never failed. These weren't policies. These were pretexts. Legal cover for an illegal goal. Exclude black voters. And when laws weren't enough, they turned to fear. Burn churches, lynch mobs, night rides from the Ku Klux Klan. Voting could cost you your job or your life. The effect was devastating. By the turn of the 20th century, black voter participation in many southern states had dropped to nearly zero. That wasn't an accident. It was policy by other means. It would take nearly a century, marches, lawsuits, arrests, assassinations, for the federal government to act. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act finally cracked the old system. It banned the literacy tests, required federal oversight of states with histories of discrimination. And it worked. Black voter registration surged. Multiracial coalitions gained power. And for the first time in generations, democracy in the South began to mean what it said on paper. But it didn't take long for the backlash to begin. In the old days, voter suppression came in broad daylight. A white man with a sheriff's badge, a mob at the courthouse, a rope on a tree. Today, it shows up with a smile, in a suit, carrying a spreadsheet. It doesn't shout racial slurs. It cites statutes. It doesn't block the courthouse door. It closes your polling place for budget reasons. It doesn't ask you to count jelly beans in a jar. It asks you for a birth certificate and a matching address across 3 databases. The goal hasn't changed, just the method. Disenfranchisement has gone digital. The major turning point? Shelby County versus Holder in 2013. The Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, gutted the key enforcement provision of the Voting Rights Act. Specifically, it struck down the requirement that jurisdictions with a history of racial discrimination get federal approval, pre-clearance, before changing their voting laws. The court's logic? Racism was no longer a significant issue in elections. Chief Justice Roberts, the white guy, wrote that things have changed in the South. And he was right, just not in the way he meant. Because within hours, states once covered by pre-clearance began rolling out a wave of new restrictions, like they had the legislation sitting in a drawer just waiting for the green light. Some moved to implement stricter voter ID laws that had previously been blocked. Others started slashing early voting days, especially Sundays, when black churches held Souls to the Polls drives. Polling locations in minority and urban neighborhoods were quietly shut down or consolidated, creating lines so long that some voters waited 5, 6, even 8 hours to cast a ballot. And then there was the cleaning of the voter rolls. Sounds innocuous, right? Who doesn't want a tidy database? But these purges were often arbitrary, sweeping, and opaque. People were removed simply for not voting in a previous election, or because their names resembled someone else's name on a suspected felon list, or because they moved apartments and the system didn't catch up. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, gone with a keystroke. No warning, no hearing, no due process. Just one day you show up and they tell you you're not on the list. And if you don't have the right form of ID, if your job doesn't let you stand in line all day, if your ride fell through, tough. That's how voter suppression works now. No dogs, no hoses, no billy clubs on the evening news. Just redistricting software, signature mismatches, and bureaucratic roadblocks. It's not that the system is broken. It's that the system is working exactly as intended, just for someone else. In a true democracy, the right to vote is fundamental, unshakable, universal. But in America, that right comes with a catch. You're only on the rolls if they let you stay there. You didn't vote last time? Maybe you sat out one, got busy, or didn't like the choices. Doesn't matter. You might already be gone from the system. You moved to a new apartment, switched counties, even changed your name after getting married. Poof! You could vanish from the rolls without ever knowing it. And if your name appears slightly different in 2 databases, like John A. Smith in one and John Smith in another, that's all it takes. This is called voter roll maintenance. Sounds responsible, sounds bureaucratic, sounds boring. But behind that bland name is a powerful political weapon. Because while the rules are neutral on paper, in practice, they're anything but. Multiple studies have found that these purges disproportionately affect black voters, whose names are more likely to appear on duplicate watch lists. Latino voters, who often face language and documentation barriers. Young voters, especially college students, who move frequently and don't always update their registration. Poor voters who may not have stable housing or reliable mail access. Elderly voters who may have name mismatches or outdated ID records. In one infamous case, Georgia purged over 500,000 voters in a single year. 500,000 people. Gone from the rolls, many of them without notice. The margin of victory in Georgia's 2018 gubernatorial race? About 55,000 votes. Coincidence? Or calculation? Because that's the real trick here. These policies don't have to block every vote. They just have to block enough. Enough to swing a close election. Enough to discourage turnout. Enough to instill doubt, exhaustion, resignation. This is what makes it so effective and so dangerous. And it's not just about denying a vote. It's about removing a person from the process entirely, silencing them before they even get to the ballot box, preemptively erasing their vote. And the worst part? They often don't even know it happened until it's too late. They show up on election day ready to vote and get told, "You're not on the list. Do you have a provisional ballot? Maybe you moved. Sorry, nothing we can do." They walk away thinking they made a mistake. But they didn't. The system did what it was designed to do. This isn't voter fraud prevention. It's voter fraud projection. A solution to a problem that doesn't exist, meant to keep the wrong people out of the voting booth. This is not a cleanup. It's a culling, caging the vote. Let's say you managed to vote. You registered in time. You weren't purged. You had the right ID. You stood in line. You filled out your ballot. Great. Now ask yourself a harder question. Did your vote actually count? Not just was it tallied, but did it have the power it was supposed to have? Because long before you showed up at the polls, someone else was already playing the game with a ruler, a map, and a very sharp pencil. Enter the dark art of gerrymandering, the practice of redrawing electoral districts to serve political power, not people. It's a simple trick, really. If your opponents are gaining ground, you don't fight them head on. You just redraw the battlefield. Pack them in here. Cram as many opposition voters as possible into a single district so they win one race by 90% and lose the rest. Crack them apart there. Split a voting block across several districts so their votes are drowned out by carefully sculpted majorities. Draw a line through a neighborhood, like a scalpel carving up a community. One block goes here, next block goes there. Suddenly, a solidly black or Latino or working class district gets sliced into 3 white, suburban-leaning ones. And voila! You've turned a competitive region into a permanent stronghold. This isn't hypothetical. This is math as a weapon. Cartography as control. It's how states like North Carolina, where voters are nearly evenly split, end up with congressional maps that favor one party 10-3. It's how Wisconsin in 2018 saw Democrats win 53% of the statewide vote, but take just 36% of the seats in the state assembly. It's how you get districts that look like Rorschach tests or ink blots spilled across a map. Districts so distorted they have names like the praying mantis, the earmuffs, and the salamander, which, by the way, is where the term gerrymander comes from. In 1812, Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry approved a district so bizarre a political cartoonist said it looked like a salamander, hence gerrymander. And more than 200 years later, the monster is still alive and well. Only now, it uses algorithms, voter files, racial data, and advanced modeling to draw lines with surgical precision. Gerrymandering lets politicians choose their voters instead of the voters choosing their politicians. And here's the kicker. It's legal. In most places, it's not just tolerated. It's standard operating procedure. Sure, the courts sometimes step in if it's too extreme, especially if it's blatantly racial. But partisan gerrymandering? That's still fair game in much of the country. As long as you say it's about the party, not race, you can do almost anything. This isn't democracy. It's districting as defense, a firewall against accountability, a way to lose the popular vote and still keep power. Ask Texas. And like voter purges and ID laws, it doesn't have to block every vote. It just has to devalue enough of them. Draw the lines right, and you lock in control for a decade, sometimes longer. You don't have to rig the voting machines if you rig the maps ahead of time. On the surface, voter ID laws seem reasonable. You need an ID to board a plane, right? To buy alcohol, to check into a hotel. So why not for voting? That's the pitch. Wrapped in common sense, dripping with patriotic overtones. One person, one vote, protected. But here's the thing. This isn't about checking ID at the ballot box. It's about what kind of ID, who has it, and who doesn't. Because when you actually dig into the details, the whole premise falls apart. First, what problem is it solving? Widespread voter fraud in the U.S., the kind where someone pretends to be someone else to vote, is virtually non-existent. One major study found just 31 credible instances of in-person voter impersonation, out of over 1 billion ballots cast between 2000 and 2014. That's a fraud rate of 0.0000031%. You're more likely to get struck by lightning twice. So, if it's not about fraud, what is it about? Look closer at the types of ID these laws require. In many states, a government-issued photo ID is the only acceptable option. But not all photo IDs are treated equally. A student ID from a state university? Rejected. A gun license issued by the same state? Accepted. That's not an accident. That's a message. And then there's the burden of getting one. To obtain a valid photo ID, you often need a birth certificate, a social security card, proof of residency, and sometimes pay a fee. But what if you were born at home in the segregated South and never got a birth certificate? What if you moved recently and your documents don't match yet? What if you're elderly, disabled, or poor and don't have the money or transportation to make it to the DMV, especially in rural counties where the nearest office is hours away and only open on Thursdays from 10 to 2? What if you're a college student living away from home, registered at school, but your license still has your parents' address? And what if your name is slightly misspelled on your documents? An accent missing, a middle name abbreviated, an extra hyphen? That's enough to be turned away. These are not edge cases. These are the product of lived realities, especially for Black, Latino, Indigenous, low-income, elderly, and transient voters. In one study, up to 11% of eligible U.S. citizens lack the kind of ID required under strict voter ID laws. That's millions of people. But it's not distributed equally. 1 in 4 Black adults lacks a valid government-issued photo ID. That's compared to just 1 in 10 white adults. These laws are framed as neutral, but they land with surgical precision. This isn't about election integrity. It's about election engineering. It's about creating just enough friction, just enough confusion, just enough doubt to make people give up. This is voter suppression with a smile, wrapped in red, white, and blue, with just enough plausible deniability to keep the courts at bay. It's not security. It's exclusion by design. And like every tactic we've covered so far, it doesn't have to stop everyone. Just enough to tip the scale. The right to vote is the foundation upon which everything else stands. It is the beginning of every other right we claim to hold sacred. But in America, it has never been handed out freely. It has been fought for, bled for, marched for, generation after generation. And every time that right expands, every time new people reach for it, there's always a push to pull it back, to find a reason, a new excuse, a new loophole, to say, not you, not yet, not here. Suppressing the vote isn't an anomaly. It's the original American sin dressed in legalese. It started with property requirements and poll taxes, with literacy tests and grandfather clauses, with lynch mobs and ballot box burnings. And now it comes wearing a lanyard and a laminated badge, with spreadsheets and gerrymandered maps, with ID scanners and exact match databases. The tactics have changed. The targets have not. They tell us it's about election security, about confidence in the system. They wrap voter suppression in the language of patriotism and call it reform. But you don't make democracy stronger by subtracting voices. You don't build confidence by cherry-picking voters. And you don't protect the vote by making it harder to cast. This is not a debate over policy. It's a struggle for power. Who gets it? Who keeps it? And who's kept out? So let's stop pretending this is something new. Let's stop giving it polite names. Let's call it what it is. This is Jim Crow 2.0. Not with dogs and hoses, but with data points and voter files. Not with poll taxes, but with precinct closures and exact match laws. And like the original, it is targeted, it is strategic, and it is working. If we don't call it out, if we don't name it plainly, if we don't fight it with the same urgency that previous generations did, then history won't just repeat itself. It'll rhyme, louder, sharper, and more cynical than ever. The question isn't whether suppression is happening. It is. The question is, what are we going to do about it? The promise of democracy was never automatic. It was never guaranteed. It was never sealed in stone. It's a living idea, and like anything living, it can wither. It can be neglected. It can be stolen. The vote has always been the target of those who fear equality, who fear change, who fear the people they claim to represent. And every time we've moved closer to this ideal, closer to real participation, real power sharing, there's been a backlash. The poll tax, the literacy test, the white primary, the ID law, the voter purge, the gerrymandered map. Same suppression, different century. Because the systems designed to keep us out never dismantle themselves. They adapt, they wait, they rebrand, and they depend on our exhaustion, our cynicism, our silence. But here's the truth. Democracy is not self-cleaning. It doesn't fix itself while we look away. It doesn't automatically improve with time, like fine wine or Wi-Fi. It requires vigilance. It requires outrage. It requires participation, even when the system is rigged. Especially when the system is rigged, because every generation inherits this fight. Not the exact same battles, but the same forces. Entrenched power versus rising voice. Suppression versus inclusion. Comfort versus justice. And our turn is now. To show up, to speak out, to call suppression by its real name. To demand a system that reflects the people, not restrains them. The right to vote isn't just a box to check. It's an engine of democracy. And if that engine stalls, if it corrodes from within, the whole system goes with it. So no, democracy isn't self-cleaning. But it can be rebuilt. It can be defended. It can be made real. If we do the work.